Great to be with you. Thank you for everybody who's here. If you're a regular attendee, thank you if you're visiting from out of town. Thank you if you're visiting and you're local, but this happens to be your first week or second week here. We're always grateful to meet new people, see new faces here. It's great to be together this morning. I was thinking about March Madness, and it's something that it draws a lot of people here. And sports are one of those things that, for many people, it kind of gives you visions of glory. You start playing sports and maybe you see a little bit of improvement and you imagine what would happen if I was a world beater, in the NBA or the NFL or a professional soccer player or whatever it is. And we all have something that in us that wants to be great. We all have something in us that wants to be good at something, that wants to be competent, that wants to be able to do something impressive or contribute to a team or stand out from the team, all those things. And I just wanted to read, actually, as we begin this morning, before we get to Ruth, some scriptures from the Bible that I think they address this. And it's really impressive. So we're not going to do a deep dive into these. I'm just going to read several of them to you. And I just want you to hear kind of the image that God has for us as people, because it's actually amazing. This is all the way from Genesis 1, right? So the very beginning of the Bible, very beginning of the story. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." So from the beginning, God created humankind in his image, which is amazing in and of itself. And then he said, "Go increase in number and fill the earth and subdue it." So this image of humankind reigning and ruling over the earth, over the world. Jesus said to them, this is Jesus talking to his followers, his immediate followers, "Truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." That's quite an amazing thought and image, isn't it? Let's keep going. In 2 Timothy 2, Paul says, he's talking to Christians, if we endure, we will also reign with him. Meaning we will reign with Jesus. When you're talking reign, you're talking about royalty, right? You're talking about kings and queens and princes and princesses. You're talking about authority. You're talking about power. In Revelation 20, the second death has no power over them. This is talking about faithful Christian witnesses. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. What a powerful thought to consider this morning. 1 Corinthians 6, Paul's talking to Christians who aren't even in a terribly good place, and he's just mentioning this kind of almost in passing, but he says, "Don't you know that the Lord's people will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels?" What? We will judge angels? We will judge the world? I mean, this is mind-boggling. And then he just goes on and talks about what's the consequence of that. We'll skip that. But I just think, just take those scriptures and just think about them for a few minutes, right? If you do nothing else this morning, that's probably worth the price of admission for coming here this morning. That you're to reign. God's vision for you is to reign and to rule. And when you look at that, forgive me for saying this in church, but sometimes I'm just like, God, are you crazy? Like, do you know what you're even saying? It's mind-boggling to me that God would do this. But, God believes in us. I think in some ways that I don't know that I believe in us, and I don't know that I believe in myself that much, but God's on another level. And it's not just God, it's actually, there's a part of this that goes to us. And if you practice for March Madness this year, then you know where this is coming from. Or if you've practiced for anything, let me go back. It says, "In a large house, there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for special purposes and some for common use. Those who cleanse themselves from the latter will be instruments for special purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared to do any good work." Paul's writing to Timothy, he's like, you actually have a part in helping yourself to be prepared for this. You can play a part in being trained and God making you more ready for that role that we're talking about, to reign and to rule. I don't know about you, but do you feel like you're ready to reign and rule the world and judge the world and angels like right now where you sit in your pew this morning? You feel like you're ready for that? So it's like there's something to shoot for, right? There's something to shoot for. And it's not something that just happens to you. Paul's writing to Timothy. He's like, hey, you get to kind of help be part of the preparation process of yourself. Likewise, in Hebrews 5, solid food is for the mature, who by constant use, that's their constant use, have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. And that scripture is just an upward call for those Christians, but really for all Christians. You can train yourself to become mature. You don't do it in a vacuum. God's got to do his part, right? But you got to do your part. And I just think that's completely amazing. That this is the vision that God has for you. Like, nobody on this earth should ever be bored. Like, you should just never be bored when you know that the vision for you from God is for you to reign and rule and judge the earth. And you have a part in training to get ready for that. Again, if you hear nothing else, I just think that's incredible. You know, at the same time, I think sometimes, I know for me, and I think this is true for other people in some cases, you can get the idea like, okay, so I got to become a super Christian, right? Like, I got to become a 5-star talented person. And, you know, if you grew up playing sports or entering into the competitive field, you know how you get that vision. You're like, I'm going to be the best. And, you know, it's great to shoot for that. Not everyone can go to the NBA. Let's just be realistic, right? I'm never going to become an NFL offensive lineman. People say anything is possible, but that's not true. Like, that's just not possible. And I'm okay with that. I accept that reality. But nonetheless, the vision is incredible. The vision is incredible, and we play a part. And I don't think it's all about becoming a 5-star perfect person that has all the talent in the world. I think there's a different way to do what these scriptures are talking about, to be prepared, to be trained by God, to be a superstar in your own way. And I think we want that. So I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about it this week in a little bit of a different context than maybe we normally do. I want to talk about the book and the character of Ruth. The book and the character of Ruth. I'm sorry, this image is fuzzy. Their cameras weren't as good back then, and that's the best resolution that I could find. But Ruth and Boaz, I want to paint a different picture today that's going to be very zoomed out, right? See the forest for the trees. And so to do that, I'm going to have to move kind of fast. I'm going to have to hit some things, move, hit some things, move, hit some things, move, because we want to paint kind of a bigger picture. So forgive me for that. If I seem like a little bit hyperactive or whatever, you know, just know that there's a point for it. I'm not just weirding out over here, but I do want to paint a picture because I think it's very powerful. All right, so if you can stick with me to the end, even if you don't get all the details, I think it's really okay. Honestly, I think you're still going to get the big picture at the end, so don't sweat it. But let's read. Actually, I'll catch you up a little bit because we're going to read quite a bit of Ruth, but not all of it. So Ruth, some of you are familiar with the story, some of you may not, so I'll just give a little bit of background. There's a couple really big characters in Ruth. That is Ruth, who's obviously a female, and Boaz, who's a male. Ruth, it comes obvious at the beginning of the book, is on hard times. She's a Moabitess. She's from Moab. She's not an Israelite, but her mother-in-law is an Israelite. That's Naomi. And they're in a situation outside of Israel. Ruth is widowed. She decides to go with Naomi back to Israel, and they're in a very dark, precarious place, right? Because they're somewhat vulnerable. They're vulnerable to famine, not having something to eat. They're vulnerable to just, in society, not really making it. They're vulnerable to not having their family line extended, as Ruth has been widowed. So it's a tough time. It's also in many ways, a dark time in the history of Israel. So have you ever read the book of Judges? If you've read the book of Judges and you kind of read it to beginning to end, you get this picture like it doesn't start off perfect, but it starts off wherever it starts off. And then through the whole history of the book of Judges, it's just this just downward spiral into something super dark. And that's actually kind of familiar if you're reading through the text as a whole, because that pattern happens more than once in the Bible. You know what I'm saying? Like if you read Genesis 3 through 11, after the fall, there's that same just downward spiral of a family in sin, then a whole lineage, then a whole civilization, then all of humanity. And it's familiar. And then right there, it picks up in the story because God kind of starts doing something new with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And you see a deliverance happening over the course of those generations through what's God doing. So there's this bright spot. Well, Ruth is kind of like that. It's kind of like this bright spot after this really dark sequence of events for the general culture. Because Ruth and Boaz, as you read it, you get familiar with their character. They have this sort of faithful character. Like they're really looking to track with God and be faithful to their end of the covenant that they have with God. So even though in Israel things are not good, there's these bright spots of Ruth and Boaz. And of course, as you read it, as most of the scriptures are, there's all these little breadcrumbs of references that if as you get more familiar with the Bible and the culture, you kind of pick up on. So there's a barley harvest. There was always a barley harvest every year. That's a seasonal thing. And as Ruth and Boaz encounter each other, it's a context of a barley harvest. There's Moab and its relationship with Israel, which was actually very tense. In fact, Moabites were very much outsiders. So you got to understand as you read this, Ruth is in many ways, she's just an outsider to the culture, which makes her extra vulnerable and not necessarily the most likely hero. And so there's these things. There's Bethlehem mentioned, actually where they connect is in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, even if you don't read the Bible, you've heard of the town of Bethlehem, right? Which is this little town. So there's all these little breadcrumbs, and the more you're familiar with them, the more it kind of helps flesh in the story. So we're going to actually do that in a little bit. We're going to follow some of those breadcrumb trails because there's a lot more than just the surface in the book of Ruth, even though there's actually a ton on the surface. So I'm going to read Ruth chapter 2, yes, the whole thing, and then a little bit of chapter 3. So we're going to read a lot of text. Hang with me. I'm going to read this more or less continuously. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you, and whenever you are thirsty, go get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You've given me comfort and spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers," or family redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, we're going to pause just there before we keep reading a bit. So just to sum up there, again, you see this story developing. You see that Ruth has kind of found herself in the domain of Boaz, this farmer. I mean, he's not like a military hero, but he clearly has some resources at his disposal. And Boaz seems to be very favorably disposed, right? He notices Ruth, first of all, and then he seems to be favorably disposed to doing whatever he can to take care of her. And this is part of the texture and the tone of the entire text. Is like this is what Israelites are supposed to do. Like this is how Israelites are supposed to be. And it stands out in incredible contrast to what you've just read in Judges. If you've just read Judges, it comes before Ruth. But you see this developing. Of course, there's still more to the story because this is very temporary. Ruth's being taken care of, and so is Naomi through Ruth, through temporary. But there's not this long-term solution. And really what a long-term solution, what would probably look like in this culture, is a marriage, right? Because in the context of a marriage, there's long-term sustainability to Ruth and Naomi being taken care of. And so that's kind of where this is going. So just so you know, what's going to come next is in that context. So let's pick it up at verse 1 of chapter 3 and read a few more verses. One day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours?" Kinsman just means family member, extended family member. "Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself. Put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz was finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you're a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer or family redeemer nearer than I am. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as sure as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." Let's pause right there. So the plot thickens here a little bit. You have this interesting encounter that, as you read it, especially from our cultural lens at least, you're like, is this turning into like a PG-13 type story? Or, and nothing untoward or sexual happens in this case, but it is interesting, right? That it's this nighttime in bed kind of scenario where she's told to go relatively sneakily undercover and asked to be covered with the corner of his cloak. So, just take that for what it's worth. And again, what's at stake here is a redemption of the family. And I know this is a little bit culturally foreign to us, but basically there was a way for extended family members to, in this case, marry. It would be Ruth, and that would be a means of her and her family being taken care of long term. And so that was actually a very good thing, although I know it's probably foreign to the way that we think. So this is getting interesting. And, the story itself, we'll go on to see what happens. It's a story that has a great ending, and it's very short. It's only 4 chapters long, so it's this really tight plot. And you can read it at face value, and you can get a lot out of it. And I know the women are actually doing a Bible study on this right now, so hopefully there's some really cool convergence and overlap between what we're talking about today and that. But there's a lot going on in those 4 chapters. But here's what I want to dig a little deeper with you this morning, because there's what's going on the surface, but then there's this really rich texture and culture and significance behind that also comes from other places in the text. You guys know the Bible, it's like parts of the Bible kind of refer back to other parts of the Bible and connect in really, really cool ways. And some of that's going on here. So I just want to talk to you through that. And I want to ask you a question. So I want to activate your brain a little bit this morning, if that's okay, or even if it's not okay. But here's some clues that I want you to think about. Does this remind you of any other part of the biblical story or narrative before Ruth? So you've got a relative redeeming a dangerous situation, like lack of food, potentially. The relative is using their resources or position to help provide protection and peace and well-being and wholeness to family members. All right, so think about that. All right, here's some things shouted out, probably some correct answers, maybe a mixture. 2, all right, this is actually going to get harder after 1. 2, there's an odd, seemingly at least, but maybe not totally, seemingly inappropriate inter-family in-law encounter. All right, so we're looking for a story that kind of matches this. And then 3, I got to tell you a little bit more about this one because it's not so obvious as we read through it, but there's some word usage, some word play that's also, I think, helpful when we're considering what this parallel story is. She said, we read this, "Why are you so kind to notice me?" And that, I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any stretch, but that word I looked up is nakar. There's this word nakar that means to notice or recognize or examine. Notice, recognize, or examine. Why are you so kind to notice? Nakar me, though I am a foreigner. Right? And then a little bit later, blessed be the man, I think Naomi said it to Ruth, blessed be the man who took notice, nakar, recognize you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been working. The name of the man I worked with today is called Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. So when we read these words, favor and kindness, these are also really common biblical words. And it's difficult to translate, but there's a word chesed, and it means faithful love or loving kindness. Faithful love and loving kindness. It's like in English, we can't even capture that word with one word. We need 2 words to capture that word and a few versions of the 2 words. But God is constantly showing his faithful love, loving kindness, but also people can show faithful love or loving kindness just like God does. And then there's another scripture that uses, again, a similar word. So I say that to say this. The third clue is these usage of these words, nakar, to recognize, examine, notice. Chesed, we said, is faithful love or loving kindness. And then the third one I didn't mention yet is Cain, which is favor. God can show favor. People can show favor. So those are your clues. When you think of those clues, does it conjure any part of the scriptures, any part of the text, any part of the story to you? Does anybody have a guess? You want to shout it out? You can shout it out now. Oh, I hear some good answers. So where I would say this is, it's helpful to examine is the account of Joseph and his brothers, right? Delivering family members when they're in need of grain. But also, here's the thing, Joseph, that is a long narrative. I think it's Genesis 37 through 50. It's a big old chunk of scripture. It's a big old chunk of Genesis. It's almost like outsized proportion. But then the whole thing is really kind of centered on, what happens with Joseph, and he gets raised up and he's under Pharaoh, and then God uses that to deliver his brothers and his family, right? And that's all before the Exodus, where they're miraculously escorted out of Egypt. In fact, that's how they get into Egypt in the first place. So that's a long chunk of text. And it's generally speaking about Joseph and his brothers and that whole storyline. But then there's this one chapter that's just plunked in there that doesn't seem to fit, doesn't seem to match. And some people have already mentioned what that chapter is, because it doesn't really center on Joseph. It centers on his brother, Judah, and Judah's daughter-in-law, Tamar. So let me look at that, because this gets really, really interesting. And again, I promise I'll pull this together and tie it together for big picture, but it's helpful to go there. Let me show you this. Incredibly, in Genesis 37, which is the beginning of the account of Joseph and his brothers, and then in Genesis 38, which is this seeming tangent to Judah and Tamar, watch this parallel, because it's incredible. You guys are probably a little more familiar with the story of Joseph. He rubs his brothers the wrong way. they're like, we're going to do him in, we're going to do him harm. And so there's on the table is to kill him, but Judah speaks up and is like, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. And so that's what happens. And then the brother's like, what are we going to tell dad? Did we really think this through? And so then they're like, well, let's take his robe, let's dip it in, the blood of an animal, and let's just show it to dad and let him draw his own conclusions, so they're not quite lying. But, they're lying. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine, Nakar. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. So he recognized it. He Nakared it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Nakar this. He Nakared it. And he drew his own conclusions, and the brothers were happy to let him draw his own conclusions. But there's some treachery in there, right? There's some familial treachery and drama going on, some deceit, some not taking care of your family, right? Fair say, the opposite. Well, okay, let's go to 38. This is Judah and Tamar. I'll try to give you the highlight version of this story, and I'll just be honest with you. It's a kind of a sordid story. Okay, so Judah has this daughter-in-law, married to Judah's son, same kind of situation, widowed. So Tamar is widowed. She's kind of vulnerable. The brother is supposed to marry her. The brother of her deceased husband is supposed to marry her. He doesn't do his family responsibility. He shirks, right? And then it's kind of Judah's job as the dad, the head of the household, to figure out what's going to happen with Tamar. How is she going to be taken care of? And he kind of shirks too, and he doesn't really do his job. And so Tamar's just twisting in the wind. And the story takes a really kind of dark turn here because she gets very desperate and enters into this plot where Judah's on the road. She poses as a prostitute. There's an encounter there. And when asked for payment, Judah doesn't have payment. And Tamar says, and Judah hasn't recognized Tamar, but Tamar has recognized Judah. So there's a nakar there, right? But it's one does and one doesn't. It's not symmetrical. And she says, well, give me your belongings, give me your cord, give me your seal, give me your staff. So that will be collateral for when you're going to pay me. Well, so that all goes down. She's got the collateral. She's got Judah's personal items. Think Joseph's personal items, his coat, right? And then someone finds out that actually Tamar has become pregnant, which is a big deal, right? Like there's a huge consequence for that in their culture. And Judah's like, get her. She deserves her consequence. And so there's this encounter with Tamar. And she's still got the cord, the seal, the staff. I might be getting some of the details wrong, but maybe enough that you can get the point. Well, look at this encounter. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law, Judah. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you, Nakar, whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah Nakared them and said, she is more righteous than I am, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. See if you Nakar this. He Nakared it. See if you Nakar this. He Nakared it. They're one chapter after another. This is Judah and Tamar's standalone chapter in the whole narrative of Joseph. And you can say that to say for Judah, as I read it anyway, for Judah, this is a huge turning point. Remember, this is the Judah who participated in the betrayal of Joseph. This is the Judah who entered into just treachery and, quite honestly, just falling down on the job with taking care of his daughter, Tamar. Judah's not like a super admirable person so far. Are you with me on that? But at this moment, he Nakars, he recognizes his eyes are opened. Not just to his guilt in the immediate situation. I think his eyes are opened on another level. And from this point forward, he actually takes care of Tamar. Tamar is delivered from that because of Judah's actions. And there's a very real tangible consequence of that whole thing as well. That real tangible consequence is Perez, the son of Judah and Tamar. That must have been an interesting family story to tell around the dinner table. But Judah also, when it comes to his brothers and Joseph, They re-encounter one another, and you know what it says? It says, Joseph nakared his brothers, but the brothers did not nakar Joseph. That's interesting, right? And then all that, Joseph tests his brothers, and the end of the story, he ends up really blessing them, but it's tense there for a while. And he asks for collateral with the brothers. And you know who stands up and says, don't take my brother's collateral, take me as collateral. I will take responsibility for the family well-being. You know who says that? Judah. Judah says, I'll stand in there. Judah taking responsibilities for his family, doing the right thing by Tamar, by his brothers, by Joseph, by their father. You also have Joseph, right, who's kind of the one we're more familiar with. Is Joseph likewise recognizing the opportunities that God has put in front of him to take care of his family, to do the next right thing, to do the covenant faithful thing, to do the God thing? Is Joseph recognizing his opportunities to protect and sustain and do what he can to deliver his family? He is. And so now let's come back to Boaz and Ruth. What do you see Boaz and Ruth doing? Both of them from different angles. Recognizing the opportunity that God's put in front of them. Nakar, having an awareness, looking at their life and their situation through that lens, thinking, who's the person that I need to take care of? How do I need to take care of them? What's the opportunities that God has put in front of me? And so I want you to just think of those. I mean, you can think of them in isolation. You can also think of them together in all those situations. These aren't necessarily people we look at, and it's really obvious from the get-go that they're like 5-star world beaters spiritually, right? But in each case, each of these people, they're recognizing the opportunities that God put in front of them. In some cases, very simple things, like, what's the next right thing that God's asking me to do in this situation? And I take from that, maybe what God needs from us is not a bunch of 5-star talented people with all the strength in the world, with the most cunning plans, with a game plan that just can't be defeated. Maybe it doesn't need us to be world beaters in that sense, and people who have no flaws and no weaknesses and superior organization. We're just invulnerable. Maybe he needs people who will partner with him and just look through that lens, recognize, examine, what are the opportunities that God is putting right in front of me? And how amazing would it be if actually those were the sorts of people and those were the sorts of decisions upon which God would actually do something much bigger and much greater than any one of them could imagine. In fact, what if those were the sort of people and decisions that God could build his redemptive plan for all of us? Would that not be amazing? Would that not be kind of mind-blowing that God would be able to do that with people just acting on the small things, the seemingly potentially small things? Or I think about Judah and Tamar, man. Like Judah, you could forgive Judah, not forgive, but you could understand if Judah just kind of like cashed in his chips. Like, look, my spiritual journey is done. Like, think about the situation this man was in, right? And I'm not going to repeat it, but you know what I'm talking about. You could understand if Judah would just be like, I'm not part of God's redemptive plan. Like, that's not what's happening here. And yet, he made the next right choice. And I think it's so interesting. So, let's just look at this for a second. You've got this big story, and I'll say everything I'm writing because I know not everybody can see. But you've got this story of Joseph. Joseph's the main character. But then you've got his brothers who do all this treachery. And who's one of his brothers? It's Judah, right? And so on a human level, it looks like the story's about Joseph and his brothers. But you know, as you read the text, right, God's involved in that as well. And then parallel to that, you have the same thing. You've got Judah over here again, and his interaction with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And even though that's super ugly and, it's not the kind of family history that any of us would be proud of. You've got something going on there. You've got that story, right? And then you've got this thing with Boaz and this thing with Ruth. And you've got their story, and it's a good story. It's a heartwarming story, and you can definitely see how God is involved in that too. We said we have deliverance, right? So Tamar is delivered, but you also got Perez. Remember we said that name, Perez? So we could look at these individually, and it's impressive enough. Like, you see the pattern. People recognizing the opportunities God put in front of them. People acting in faithful love and loving kindness, the same kind of faithful love and loving kindness that God shows towards us. You've got that going. And that hopefully is encouragement to us. But I think it also goes deeper than that. And so Ruth, I told you, it's a short book. It's only 4 chapters long. This is not one of those books that goes on and on with like a million, sub-stories and genealogies and stuff like that, where, all kinds of names are entered in and the names are being dropped everywhere. But there's this one in chapter 4 I got to show you because it's interesting. It's fascinating. So let me get to that. Okay, so this is chapter 4, verse, I think it's 11. And this is after the plan has worked. Boaz gets the opportunity to marry Ruth. Ruth is happy about that. Boaz is happy about that. It's a very good thing, right? And then actually there's a child produced, kind of like the Judah, Tamar, Perez story. There's a child produced, Obed. And so the whole community kind of sees what's happened here with Boaz and Ruth, and they're seeing and they're rejoicing and they're aware of that. And here's this quote. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah. Wait, hold up. Rachel and Leah, the moms of who? Rachel is the mom of Joseph. Leah, the mom of Judah. Okay. Who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah, that's Bethlehem, and be famous in Bethlehem. You have Bethlehem again. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Okay, of all the people to say, may your family be like this family, that's an interesting one, right? May your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. If you didn't know that was there, you probably wouldn't guess that is coming. And maybe if I just read that to you, you'll understand I'm not completely making up these connections just out of thin air. But it gets even more interesting. Because if you keep reading in chapter 4, it goes a little further. And let's read that together. Then Naomi took the child in her arms, this is the child of Boaz and Ruth, Obed, and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. And they kind of mean Naomi has a son, vicariously through Ruth, just like her provision was through Ruth as well. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Well, that's even more interesting. This, then, is the family line of Perez. What? Perez was the father of Hezron, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Did you just catch that? They're not just related thematically, they're related, like genetically related, genealogically related. The offspring of Perez and that whole encounter is Boaz. The offspring of Boaz is David. All right, so we've got these stories, and you can read them in isolation, and that's good. You'll get so much out of it if you read it in isolation. But also when you zoom out and you try to make sure that you can see the forest and not miss the forest for the trees, there's something else going on here, right? Like, whoa. So this produced Perez. An outcome of that was Boaz. And then an outcome of that was whom? David. Now, sorry if I'm geeking out a little bit, but you got to step back and just, let me move this so you can see it. You got to step back and just see, like, for a second, like, that's a God thing. Nobody in this picture could have either done that or thought that. And that's really helpful. It's really helpful because when you go to think about your part and God's part, this kind of thing, big picture, this is God's part. You can't do it. You don't even need to try or feel like you need to try. You can just recognize the opportunities that he puts right in front of you. It might be a single person. It might be a single decision. You may right now feel like Judah. If you knew how dark my life is, if you knew what I've done up to this point, if you knew the spot I was in, I'm not looking for God to use me. The power of one person who will nakar, recognize the opportunity. The power of one decision, even after a string of terrible decisions. And God can take that, and then other people doing the same thing, and he can weave something like this? Are you kidding me? Do you have any idea how powerful you are? You know, you probably have 1,000 people you know. You know that? I mean, some of you have over 1,000 Facebook friends alone, who, of course, are very real friends in every way. But each of those 1,000, they know 1,000. Do you know how many people that is? Multiply them together, that's 1 million. You're one person away from about 1 million people, just roughly speaking. Each of those knows 1,000 people. Well, now you're at 1 billion. So you're a couple people away from influencing 1 billion people. That's just in the now. We're not even talking about generationally to come. God can do so much with one person, with one nakar, in one situation or scenario. Please hear that this morning. And we're out of time. We're going to transition to communion. And if you can believe it, the story gets more interesting here. Some of you already kind of know where I'm going with this. Because, you know, Ruth isn't the only one with a little genealogy. Matthew starts with a genealogy. We go back to these same people. Judah, the father of Perez. Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez, the father of Hezron, and it goes on from there. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And it keeps going on from there. And then if you go down a few more generations, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. You see, this genealogy is not complete. There's a whole lot more names in there. And then one right here is Jesus. I mean, guys, the text, the Bible, the story, it is hyperlinked. And you can read any of the stories and get so much out of them. But you know, you could get some really amazing things out of the connections between them as well. There's a whole new treasure trove there. And I was just looking at this. This is just, you know, don't take this as doctrine. This is just me thinking about the themes in these, but you can look up there because I know this is way too small for you to see. But some of the themes in the story of Judah and Joseph and Ruth and Boaz, you've got the recognition, the nakar, you've got the favor, the Cain, you've got the faithful love, the chesed. You have Bethlehem, which is where Rachel, the mother of Joseph, passed away. You have issues of deliverance and protection. Remember when it talks about coming under the wings of God, and then Ruth says, let me get under the corner of your cloak. That's the same word, the wings of your cloak, the corner of your cloak. You've got a provision of grain happening in both stories. You've got someone in the family redeeming and taking care of the family. You've got God bringing shalom and wholeness and health out of chaos. You've got all those things in both of those stories, and that's incredibly powerful. And of course, they're connected genealogically, as we said, as well as just to what's going on in the stories and how God is working through flawed people. And then you add Jesus to that. And I mean, it's incredible, but do all these themes apply to Jesus? Nakar, did he recognize the opportunities in front of him? Show favor, show faithful love. Bethlehem, well, yeah. Deliverance, of course, you know, the cross happened during Passover, the biggest deliverance of all time. It was thought that when the Messiah comes, If you could just touch the corner of his cloak, the wing of his cloak, you would be healed. Does that sound familiar to you? Of a woman reaching for the corner of Jesus' cloak for protection and healing? You've got provision, the barley harvest. The day of first fruits was the Sunday after Passover. It was the first fruits of God's provision. That's the day that Jesus rose. First fruits. Family redeemer. Jesus is said to be our brother who has redeemed and paid the price for us. You've got God working through people to bring shalom, wholeness out of chaos. Just incredible. Just incredible. Could we just take a few moments and just praise God and honor God for the type of God that he is and resolve, man, all I got to do is play my part. I can't tell you exactly what that looks like for you right now because we are a group of very complex individuals with very complex contexts, but you can, Nakar. I ask you to think about that as we take communion. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, we're grateful for this time to be together. We're very grateful for who you are, and we know that we only see just a small sliver. I pray that the eyes of our heart can be widened, deepened, that we can see you more clearly. Please help us with that, Father, on the individual level, at the collective level. We don't even understand all the ways that you have acted on our behalf through Jesus, but I pray we can plumb those depths, God, and that we can decide that we too want to recognize the opportunities that you give us and act on them like you do, in faithful love and loving kindness, pouring out favor wherever we can. We thank you that you've done that for us in Jesus, and we pray in his name. Amen.